Commander Jake Mitchell was having what he thought would be a normal Tuesday morning aboard the UES Thunderbolt. Coffee was brewing in the galley, the night shift was wrapping up their reports, and the biggest concern on his mind was whether the food processors would finally get that weird metallic taste out of the scrambled eggs. He stood at the bridge's main console, scrolling through routine patrol updates and maintenance schedules when the priority alert system suddenly screamed to life. The sound made everyone on the bridge freeze. In Jake's 15 years of military service, he'd heard that particular alarm maybe 3 times, and each time it meant someone, somewhere, was dying in large numbers. The main screen flickered and displayed the official seal of the Galactic Council, which was weird because the Council usually spent its time arguing about trade routes and taxation, not sending emergency broadcasts. Council Speaker Vorton appeared on screen, and Jake immediately knew something was seriously wrong. The normally calm alien leader looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect ceremonial robes were wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he began speaking. All council members, we have received a code red distress signal from the Zalani colony at Kepler 442b. The Korthak hegemony has launched a full-scale invasion. Civilian casualties are mounting. Jake felt his stomach drop. He'd met Zalani before during diplomatic missions, gentle creatures who reminded him of a cross between deer and dolphins. They were farmers, artists, philosophers who spent their time growing beautiful gardens and creating music that could make grown humans cry. They had never hurt anyone in their entire species' history. The idea of them under attack was like hearing that someone was bombing a children's hospital. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, his communications officer, looked up from her station with wide eyes. She'd been with Jake for 3 years now, and he could tell she was thinking the same thing he was. The Korthak were basically space pirates with government backing. They were known throughout the galaxy for taking slaves, destroying anything beautiful they couldn't steal, and generally being the kind of creatures that made you lock your doors at night. Council military assets are currently engaged across 7 sectors, Vorton continued, and his voice cracked slightly. Response time to the Zalani system would be 14 standard days minimum. By then. The speaker didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone in the galaxy knew what the Korthak did to civilian populations. 14 days might as well be 14 years. Rodriguez leaned forward, her fingers dancing across her console as she pulled up the transmission details. Sir, they're asking for volunteers. Any ships that can respond immediately. Jake stared at the star map showing the Zalani system's location. It was way out in contested space, the kind of neighborhood where smart captains traveled in groups and kept their weapons charged. For human ships running at maximum burn, it would take 3 days to get there. 3 days of hoping the Zalani could hold out, 3 days of knowing that every hour of delay meant more innocent people dying. The bridge around him had gone completely quiet. His crew knew him well enough to recognize the look on his face. It was the same expression he'd worn when they'd rescued those miners from the collapsing asteroid station last year, or when they'd evacuated that research colony ahead of the solar flare. It was his, "we're about to do something dangerous for the right reasons," face. Rodriguez, get me Fleet Admiral Davis on Priority 1, Jake ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now pumping through his system. And prep the long-range communications array. Looks like we're about to show the galaxy what humans do when innocent people need help. Rodriguez's fingers flew across her control panel with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, the weathered face of Fleet Admiral Robert Davis appeared on the main screen. Davis was old-school military, the kind of officer who'd earned his rank through decades of keeping the peace in a galaxy that often didn't want to be peaceful. His gray hair was perfectly regulation, but his eyes held the kind of fire that Jake had seen in veteran Marines right before they kicked down doors. "Admiral, I assume you've seen the Council transmission?" Jake asked. "I have, Commander. Question is, how fast can your squadron be ready for deep space deployment?" Jake glanced over at Lieutenant Tom Walsh, his tactical officer, who was already pulling up fleet readiness reports on his screen. Walsh was one of those naturally gifted officers who could tell you the combat status of every ship in the fleet off the top of his head. The Thunderbolt, Liberty, and Defiant can be underway in 2 hours, sir. Full combat loadout, Jake replied. Admiral Davis leaned forward, and Jake could practically feel the determination radiating through the screen. Make it happen. I'm authorizing Operation Lifeline. We're going to show these Korthak what happens when they threaten innocent people. He paused, his expression growing even more serious. And Commander? The Council estimates enemy strength at over 80 vessels. We're sending everything we have. As the transmission ended, Jake turned to address his crew. Through the bridge's observation windows, he could already see other human ships beginning their preparation sequences. Running lights flickered as maintenance crews performed final system checks, and he could hear the distant hum of engines spinning up to full power. All hands, this is the captain, he announced over the ship's internal communications system. We've got civilians under attack, and we're the only ones close enough to help. I won't lie to you, we're outnumbered and outgunned. But we're human, and that's going to have to be enough. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every station on the bridge acknowledged with crisp professionalism, but Jake could hear the underlying emotion in their voices. This was what they'd trained for, what they'd joined the fleet to do. Not to conquer or expand human territory, but to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. Around him, his crew moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of working together. Rodriguez was coordinating with the other ships in their squadron, Walsh was running final weapons checks, and the engineering teams were already pushing the reactors toward maximum output. In 2 hours, they would be racing through hyperspace toward a battle they might not survive. But that didn't matter. Somewhere out there, gentle creatures who had never hurt anyone were calling for help. And humans had never been very good at ignoring that kind of call. 3 hours of racing through hyperspace felt like 3 years to Jake and his crew. When the Thunderbolt and the rest of the human fleet finally dropped back into normal space at the edge of the Zalani system, Jake was hoping against hope that maybe they'd gotten there in time. Maybe the Korthak were still just posturing, maybe the civilians had managed to evacuate, maybe this wouldn't be as bad as everyone feared. One look at the tactical display shattered those hopes completely. Tactical report, Jake ordered, though he could already see enough on the main screen to make his blood boil. Lieutenant Walsh stared at his console for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Sir, I'm reading approximately 90 Korthak vessels in the system. They've got a complete blockade around Zalani Prime, and... Walsh paused, his hands clenching into fists. Jesus Christ, sir, they're using civilian transports for target practice. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he watched the main screen. Korthak fighter craft were darting around like sharks in bloody water, chasing down defenseless refugee ships that were trying desperately to escape the system. These weren't military vessels or armed transports, these were civilian evacuation craft packed with families, children, elderly Zalani who had probably never seen violence in their entire lives. As Jake watched, a Korthak destroyer fired a single plasma burst that vaporized a fleeing transport ship in seconds. The explosion lit up the darkness of space for just a moment before fading, taking hundreds of innocent lives with it. On the planet below, orbital bombardment lit up the night side like a deadly fireworks display. Communications from Admiral Davis, Sir, Rodriguez reported, her voice steady despite the horror they were all witnessing. The Admiral's weathered face appeared on screen, and Jake had never seen him look quite like this before. Davis was known throughout the fleet for his calm professionalism, but right now his eyes were burning with the kind of cold fury that made smart people step back and give him room. All ships, this is Admiral Davis, the Admiral said, his voice deadly calm. I want solutions, people. How do we save those civilians and deal with an enemy that outnumbers us nearly 10 to 1? Captain Lisa Thompson's voice crackled over the comm from the Liberty. She was probably the most level-headed officer in the fleet, which made her next words even more chilling. Sir, conventional engagement is suicide. They've got us outgunned 10 to 1 in pure tonnage. If we go ship to ship in open space, they'll cut us apart. Then we don't fight conventional, growled Captain Mike Stevens from the Defiant. Stevens was an old Marine who'd seen ground combat on 3 different worlds, and Jake could hear the barely contained violence in his voice. These alien bastards are expecting the usual council response. You know, polite formation flying, civilized rules of engagement, probably a few strongly worded demands for surrender. They've never tangled with humans before. Jake found himself nodding as an idea began forming in his mind. Humans had been fighting wars on Earth for thousands of years, and Earth wasn't a nice, civilized world with predictable weather and friendly wildlife. Earth was a planet that tried to kill you in a dozen different ways every single day. It had taught humanity to be creative, resourceful, and absolutely ruthless when protecting what mattered. Admiral, Jake said, I recommend we implement Hunter Protocol. We use this asteroid belt for cover, hit their supply lines and communication relays, and force them to fight on our terms instead of theirs. Admiral Davis actually smiled at that suggestion, though it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile a wolf might give right before it struck. Approved. All ships, break formation and go hunting. Remember, people, our priority is saving every Zolani civilian we can. Everything else is secondary. Jake felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as the human fleet began to scatter. This was what humans did best, turning disadvantages into advantages, using terrain and tactics to level impossible odds. As his ship moved toward the asteroid belt, Jake switched to the ship's internal communications. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to his crew, we're about to teach the galaxy why you don't mess with Deathworlders when they're protecting innocent people. All weapons are now free to engage, but watch your targeting. There are civilians down there who are counting on us. Lieutenant Beverly Parker, his weapons officer, looked up from her console with a grim expression. Sir, we're getting a transmission from the Korthak fleet. Audio only. Jake straightened in his captain's chair. Put it through. The bridge suddenly filled with harsh, guttural sounds that barely qualified as language. The ship's computers worked frantically to translate, and when the words appeared on screen, they were exactly what Jake had expected from these creatures. Unknown vessels, you are trespassing in claimed Korthak territory. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed like the weakling prey you protect. Jake looked around at his bridge crew, saw the determination on their faces, and smiled coldly. Lieutenant Parker, open a channel. Channel open, sir. Jake stood up slowly, making sure his voice would carry the full weight of human authority when he spoke. This is Commander Mitchell of the human fleet. You have exactly 10 minutes to cease fire on all civilian targets and begin immediate withdrawal from this system. This is your first and final warning. The response came back almost immediately, filled with harsh laughter that made Jake's skin crawl. Foolish mammals. You are 12 tiny ships against our mighty armada. We will add your bones to our trophy collections and sell your survivors in the slave markets. Jake cut the transmission with a sharp gesture, his patience officially exhausted. Around him, his crew was already moving to battle stations with practiced efficiency. Red alert lights bathed the bridge in crimson, and he could hear the hum of weapons systems charging to full power. Well, Jake said quietly, we tried diplomacy. All stations, battle stations. Time to show these monsters what humans learned fighting wars on the galaxy's most dangerous planet. In the depths of space, 12 human ships began moving through the asteroid field like ghosts, preparing to teach the Korthak the difference between bullying defenseless civilians and facing warriors from a world that had forged humanity in fire and blood. The hunt was about to begin. The first Korthak patrol was having what they probably thought was a routine sweep through the asteroid belt. 3 heavy destroyers moving in a standard search pattern, their crews likely joking about the foolish mammals who dared to challenge the mighty Korthak fleet. They had no idea that death was waiting for them in the shadow of a massive asteroid, completely invisible to their sensors. Jake watched the tactical display with predatory patience as the enemy ships approached the kill zone. The Thunderbolt sat perfectly still, powered down to minimal emissions, hidden behind a chunk of rock the size of a small moon. 2 human frigates, the Ranger and the Hawk, were positioned at precise angles to create a perfect crossfire. It was an ambush technique humans had perfected in 1,000 different wars across Earth's bloody history. "Range 2,000 kilometers and closing," whispered Lieutenant Walsh, his voice barely audible as he tracked the approaching targets. 1,500. 1,000. Target lock acquired on all 3 vessels. Jake felt that familiar calm that came over him in combat situations, the same feeling he'd had during boarding actions against pirates and rescue operations in hostile territory. Time seemed to slow down as he raised his hand, waiting for the perfect moment. 500 kilometers. "They're directly in the kill zone, sir." Jake dropped his hand. "Fire." What happened next lasted maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds changed everything. The Thunderbolt's main rail gun spoke with a voice like thunder, sending a tungsten slug the size of a telephone pole through the lead Korthak destroyer at a significant fraction of light speed. The alien ship didn't just explode, it simply ceased to exist, transformed into a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated gas and twisted metal. At the same instant, the 2 frigates opened up with everything they had. Plasma cannons, missile batteries, and point defense systems all fired in perfect coordination. The second Korthak ship managed to get its shields up for maybe half a second before the combined firepower overwhelmed its defenses and tore it apart. The third destroyer, realizing it was in a death trap, tried to run but took a direct hit to its engine section and went spinning helplessly into the asteroid field. 3 bogies down, reported Walsh with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from knowing they'd just saved innocent lives. "The survivors are breaking off and calling for reinforcements." Jake smiled coldly as he watched the remaining Korthak ships fleeing in panic. "Let them come. Rodriguez, signal the Liberty and the Defiant. Phase 2 is a go." What the Korthak didn't understand was that this wasn't just a single ambush. This was the opening move in a carefully orchestrated campaign that would use every lesson humanity had learned during thousands of years of warfare on the most dangerous planet in the galaxy. Across the system, human ships began emerging from concealment like ghosts materializing out of the void. Captain Thompson and the Liberty had been playing the long game, positioning themselves near the system's gas giant where the planet's massive magnetic field completely masked their presence. When they finally revealed themselves, it was to launch a devastating strike against a Korthak fuel depot that had been sitting there like a fat, undefended target. Thompson's attack was a masterpiece of precision warfare. Instead of simply blowing up the depot and everyone around it, her crew used surgical strikes to disable the facility's defenses, then sent in boarding teams to secure the fuel supplies. Within 20 minutes, the Korthak had lost their primary refueling station, and the Liberty was already disappearing back into the magnetic storm surrounding the gas giant. Meanwhile, Captain Stevens and the Defiant were conducting their own private war in the outer system. Stevens had been a Marine before he became a ship captain, and it showed in his tactics. The Defiant moved through the scattered Korthak scout ships like a predator stalking prey, using stealth technology and electronic warfare to remain invisible until the moment of attack. One by one, Korthak reconnaissance vessels simply vanished from their fleet sensors. No distress calls, no dramatic explosions, just ships that were there one moment and gone the next. It was psychological warfare at its finest, the kind of thing that made enemy commanders start jumping at shadows and second-guessing every decision. "Sir," Rodriguez called out from her communications station, excitement clear in her voice, "we're receiving a transmission from the planet's surface. It's the Zalani resistance." Jake straightened immediately. This was what they'd been hoping for, contact with survivors on the ground who could help coordinate rescue operations. "Put it through." The voice that came through the speakers was weak and tired, but there was steel underneath the exhaustion. The speaker was using heavily accented standard, but every word was clear and determined. "Human ships, this is Zalani Defense Coordinator Melani. We have approximately 10,000 civilians trapped in the capital city. The Korthak they're using them as living shields around their command posts." Jake felt his expression harden. Using civilians as human shields was exactly the kind of cowardly tactic he'd expected from these monsters, but it also made the rescue operation infinitely more complicated. Coordinator Melani, this is Commander Mitchell. We see your situation. Can your people mark safe landing zones for our rescue teams? We can try, came the reply, but the Korthak have complete air superiority. Any landing craft will be shot down before they can reach the surface. Jake's smile was cold and predatory. Leave that to us. Just mark those zones and keep your people ready to move fast when we give the word. The cavalry's coming, and we've got a few tricks these aliens have never seen before. He switched to fleet communications, addressing all 12 human ships scattered throughout the system. All ships, this is Mitchell. Time to show these aliens why humans evolved as persistence hunters. We don't give up, we don't back down, and we sure as hell don't abandon people who need our help. Admiral Davis's voice came back immediately, carrying the full authority of the human fleet. Permission granted, Commander. All ships, prepare for planetary assault operations. Remember, people, we're here to save lives, not take them unnecessarily. Every civilian we rescue is a victory, and every enemy soldier who surrenders gets treated according to our standards, not theirs. As the human fleet began its coordinated assault on Korthak positions, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of fierce pride. The aliens were about to learn the hard way that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their firepower. It was their absolute, stubborn, completely irrational refusal to abandon anyone who needed help, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The real battle was just beginning. Marine Captain Danny Foster had seen combat on 6 different worlds, but as his dropship Valkyrie screamed through the burning atmosphere of Zalani Prime, he knew this mission was going to be different. The ship shook violently as it pushed through the smoke and debris from orbital bombardments, and through the small porthole windows, he could see the capital city burning below them like a vision of hell. Around him, 24 of humanity's most elite soldiers were going through their pre-combat routines with the kind of calm professionalism that only comes from years of training and real-world experience. These weren't regular Marines or Army infantry. These were the kind of soldiers who got called when regular soldiers couldn't handle the job, men and women who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions in human space. Sergeant Kevin Miller was methodically checking his rifle's targeting system for the 3rd time, his weathered face showing no emotion despite the fact that they were flying into what was essentially a suicide mission. Next to him, Corporal Rachel Bennett was reviewing building schematics on her tactical display, memorizing every entrance, exit, and potential ambush point in the target zone. 2 minutes to landing zone Alpha, called Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Hayes from the pilot's seat. Hayes was one of the best pilots in the fleet, which was why she'd volunteered to fly this particular mission. Latest intel shows heavy Korthak presence around the civilian shelters. They're using the Zalani as living shields, the cowards. Foster activated his comm unit, his voice cutting through the noise of the engines and the distant sound of explosions. Roger that, Colonel. Teams 1 and 2 will secure the primary evacuation site. Team 3 sets up overwatch and keeps any reinforcements from crashing our party. He looked around at his soldiers, seeing their faces reflected in the tactical visors of their combat helmets. Remember, people, we're here to save lives. Every single Zalani civilian gets out alive, and we treat any Korthak prisoners according to human military standards, even if they don't know what those are. The dropship suddenly lurched violently to one side as Korthak anti-aircraft fire exploded nearby, close enough to rattle their teeth. Hayes cursed creatively as she fought to keep the ship stable, diving low between burning buildings to avoid the worst of the defensive fire. 30 seconds, she called back. Hope you boys and girls are ready for this. Foster felt the familiar calm that always came over him right before combat. It was the same feeling he'd had during the siege of New Damascus, or when they'd had to retake that mining station from pirates last year. Time seemed to slow down, his senses became sharper, and the world reduced itself to simple, clear objectives. The Valkyrie hit the ground hard in what had once been a beautiful public plaza filled with Zalani art and fountains. Now it was a crater-filled wasteland of broken stone and twisted metal, with smoke rising from dozens of small fires. The rear ramp dropped with a hydraulic hiss, and Foster was the first one out, his assault rifle already up and scanning for targets. What he saw made his blood boil with cold fury. Korthak soldiers had taken positions behind overturned civilian vehicles and chunks of rubble, and they were using terrified Zalani families as human shields. The aliens held their weapons casually, clearly confident that the humans wouldn't risk hitting innocent civilians. They had badly underestimated human ingenuity. "Contact front," shouted Miller as bright green plasma bolts started sizzling through the air around them. "I count at least 30 hostiles in mixed positions, all using civilian cover." Foster smiled grimly as he activated his armor's tactical display, which immediately began analyzing the battlefield and marking enemy positions. The Korthak were making a classic mistake, fighting this like a conventional military engagement between civilized species who followed predictable rules of warfare. They had no idea they were facing soldiers who had learned urban combat in the ruins of Earth's most devastated cities, warriors who had been forged in conflicts that would have broken most galactic species. "Miller, take your squad left through that rubble field," Foster ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "Bennett, take your team right and set up overwatch from that collapsed building. I'm going straight up the middle with the negotiation team." What happened next would be studied in human military academies for decades to come. Using smoke grenades to obscure visibility and electronic countermeasures to disrupt Korthak communications, the human soldiers seemed to simply vanish into the battlefield. They moved through terrain that the Korthak had considered impassable, using every piece of debris, every shadow, every angle of approach that their alien enemies had overlooked. Miller's squad was the first to make contact, but not in the way the Korthak expected. Instead of opening fire and risking civilian casualties, they used non-lethal takedown techniques perfected in countless peacekeeping operations. Stun grenades, sonic disruptors, and precision nerve strikes left 6 Korthak positions completely neutralized without a single shot being fired. The alien soldiers simply collapsed unconscious, their weapons falling harmlessly to the ground. Meanwhile, Bennett's Overwatch team had taken position in a partially collapsed government building that gave them perfect fields of fire over the entire plaza. Using railgun sniper rifles with targeting systems that could calculate bullet trajectories to the millimeter, they began systematically eliminating Korthak officers and communication specialists. Each shot was perfectly placed, disrupting the alien command structure without endangering any of the civilian hostages. But it was Foster's direct assault that truly demonstrated what human soldiers were capable of when innocent lives were at stake. Charging straight through enemy fire, his powered armor absorbing plasma bolts that should have killed him instantly, he reached the first group of terrified Zalani families and began the delicate work of separating them from their captors. The Korthak found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything they had ever encountered. These humans moved with deadly precision through urban terrain, used non-lethal force when possible but overwhelming violence when necessary, and somehow managed to rescue civilians while simultaneously destroying organized resistance. "This is Foster to all teams," he called over the comm as he zip-tied another unconscious Korthak soldier. "Primary objective secured. I count 47 Zalani civilians ready for immediate evacuation, and 23 enemy combatants neutralized. 18 prisoners secured alive, 5 confirmed dead." High above in orbit, Commander Mitchell watched the tactical display with professional satisfaction, seeing his Marines accomplish what most military experts would have considered impossible. "All dropships, begin evacuation protocol immediately. Marine teams, you have 15 minutes before enemy reinforcements arrive." But the Korthak commander had already seen enough of human capabilities for one day. 2 weeks after the battle at Zalani Prime, Commander Jake Mitchell found himself standing in the most important political building in the galaxy, wearing a dress uniform that felt uncomfortably stiff compared to his usual combat gear. The council chambers on Nexus Station were designed to impress, with soaring ceilings and holographic displays that could show real-time data from anywhere in known space. Today, those displays were showing something that had never been seen before in galactic history. Representatives from dozens of different species filled the curved amphitheater, their alien faces displaying emotions that Jake was still learning to read. Some looked amazed, others appeared thoughtful, and more than a few seemed genuinely frightened. They were all watching recorded footage from the Zalani rescue operation, and Jake could tell that what they were seeing was challenging everything they thought they knew about warfare. Council Speaker Vorton stood at the central podium, his usually perfect composure showing slight cracks as he addressed the assembled delegates. The tall, reed-thin alien had probably given thousands of speeches in his long career, but Jake could tell this one was different. This one was about changing the fundamental assumptions of how wars were fought in the galaxy. The human response was unprecedented, Vorton said, carefully choosing each word. In less than 72 hours, a force that was outnumbered nearly 8-1 achieved complete tactical victory while suffering essentially zero casualties and rescuing over 15,000 civilian hostages. Jake glanced over at Admiral Davis, who was standing nearby in his own dress uniform, and had to suppress a smile. The Admiral was trying very hard to maintain his serious expression, but Jake could see the hint of satisfaction in his eyes. The zero casualties figure wasn't completely accurate since Lieutenant Rodriguez had gotten a mild concussion when the Thunderbolt took a glancing plasma hit, but that was close enough to perfect for anyone keeping score. More significantly, the speaker continued, and his voice carried a note of something that might have been wonder. Post-battle analysis indicates that human forces exercised remarkable restraint throughout the engagement. Of the nearly 300 Korthak combatants who were directly engaged in combat, only 47 were killed in action. The remainder were captured alive and are currently being held according to human military protocols. The speaker paused, letting that information sink in before delivering the part that Jake knew would really shock the assembled delegates. These protocols apparently include providing medical care to wounded prisoners, regular meals that meet their species' dietary requirements, and recreational time. The humans are treating enemies who were using civilians as shields better than most council species treat their own prisoners. A wave of surprised murmurs rippled through the chamber. Jake could see delegates leaning over to whisper to their neighbors, their expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Most galactic species had a simple approach to warfare: you fought until one side was completely destroyed or surrendered unconditionally. The idea of treating brutal enemies with dignity and compassion was completely foreign to their military thinking. Admiral Davis stepped forward when Speaker Vorton gestured for him to address the assembly. The Admiral moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily to every corner of the massive chamber. Honorable Counselors, he began, humanity's response to the Zalani crisis reflects our fundamental military philosophy. We believe in using overwhelming force when necessary, but only in service of defensive objectives. Our goal is always to achieve victory with the minimum necessary casualties among both civilian populations and enemy combatants. He paused, letting his words register with the diverse audience before continuing. We don't fight wars to conquer territory or dominate other species. We fight to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and we stop fighting the moment our objectives are achieved. Victory without honor is just another form of defeat. Jake looked out into the audience and spotted the Zalani delegation sitting in the front rows. Their large, expressive eyes were bright with what he had learned was their species' way of showing deep gratitude. Earlier in the ceremony, Coordinator Melani had given a speech describing how human soldiers had shared their own combat rations with hungry Zalani children during the evacuation, and how they had carried elderly Zalani to safety when the aliens were too weak to walk. Speaker Vorton cleared his throat and straightened to his full impressive height. The Council has discussed this matter extensively, and we have a formal request to make. His voice carried the weight of official galactic government as he continued. Given the demonstrated effectiveness of human military doctrine, and considering the remarkable restraint shown in its application, we formally request that humanity consider taking a leadership role in joint council military operations during future crisis situations. The chamber fell completely silent. Jake could practically feel the tension in the air as dozens of species waited to hear how humanity would respond to this unprecedented offer. In the galaxy's long history, military leadership had always rotated among the older, more established species. No one had ever offered such authority to the newest members of the Council. Admiral Davis took his time considering the request, and when he finally smiled, it wasn't the cold, predatory expression Jake had seen during combat operations. This was something warmer, more genuinely human, the kind of smile that spoke of hope and genuine friendship. "We would be deeply honored to serve alongside our allies in defense of innocent life wherever it may be threatened," he said simply. "After all, that's what humans do. We protect those who need protecting, and we never leave anyone behind." As the formal session began to wind down and delegates started filing out of the chamber, Jake found himself walking slowly toward the exit, listening to conversations happening around him. Two alien military officers were discussing the mission in hushed, almost reverent tones that made Jake feel oddly proud. "Did you analyze the tactical recordings?" one was asking. "They somehow turned an entire asteroid field into a strategic weapon. I've never seen anything like it." "That's not what impressed me most," replied the other. "Did you notice that they had medical teams treating wounded Korthak soldiers even while the battle was still going on? Even after everything those monsters did to innocent Zelani civilians?" Jake smiled to himself as he continued walking. The galaxy was finally beginning to understand that humans weren't dangerous simply because they came from one of the most hostile planets in known space. They were dangerous because they had somehow learned to combine that deadly capability with something much rarer and more powerful, genuine compassion for others, even their enemies. Behind him, he could hear Admiral Davis talking to a group of young council military officers who were eager to learn human tactical methods. "The most important lesson you can learn," the Admiral was saying, "is that true strength isn't measured by how much destruction you can cause or how many enemies you can kill. Real strength is measured by how many innocent people you can save and protect." Jake nodded to himself as he stepped out into the corridor. It was, he reflected, a very human way to think about warfare, and an even more human way to end what could have been a devastating conflict. The galaxy was about to become a much safer place for innocent civilians everywhere.